The grand ballroom of the Sinclair Hotel glittered with crystal chandeliers and champagne flutes. Victoria Chen stood in her ivory wedding gown, barely 19 years old, watching her new husband, Alexander Blackwood, command the room with effortless authority. At 35, he was the youngest CEO in his industry, powerful beyond measure, handsome in that sharp-edged way that intimidated most people. Their marriage had been arranged by their families, his father's business empire intertwining with her father's tech company in a merger sealed with matrimony. Victoria had agreed because her parents needed this alliance. Alexander had agreed because he always honored his commitments, even ones he didn't particularly want. The wedding night passed in mechanical politeness. Alexander worked on his laptop in the suite's living room, while Victoria lay awake in the bedroom, still wearing the silk nightgown her mother had packed. They were strangers, sharing a space, nothing more. The next morning, Victoria woke to find Alexander already gone to the office. A note sat on the kitchen counter. "I'll be working late. Help yourself to anything. Alexander." Not Alex, not your husband, just his formal signature. Days turned to weeks. Alexander maintained a relentless schedule, leaving before dawn, returning after midnight. When they did share meals, conversation was stilted, revolving around weather and headlines. Victoria tried to adapt to this cold, lonely existence in his penthouse, decorating corners with small plants, cooking elaborate dinners that often went uneaten. She'd enrolled in online university courses to fill the empty hours. Her friends had scattered after high school, pursuing dreams Victoria had sacrificed for family duty. Her parents called weekly, asking about grandchildren she wasn't producing, about a marriage that existed only on paper. One evening, after 3 months of this hollow existence, Victoria made a decision. She couldn't live like this, invisible, unwanted, slowly disappearing in the shadow of a man who barely acknowledged her existence. She deserved more than being a business transaction. So she left. Victoria planned carefully. She withdrew money from the account Alexander had set up for her, only what she felt she'd earned through 3 months of trying to make an impossible situation work. She packed a single suitcase with essentials, left her wedding ring on the kitchen counter beside a brief note. "I'm sorry, I can't do this anymore. Please don't look for me." She took a bus to Portland, then another to Seattle, constantly moving, leaving no digital trail. She'd read enough thrillers to know Alexander had resources to find her if he truly wanted to. But she gambled that he wouldn't bother. After all, she'd only been an inconvenience, a business obligation he'd barely noticed. In Seattle, Victoria found a small studio apartment in a neighborhood where nobody asked questions. She got a job waitressing at a diner using her mother's maiden name, Chen, which was common enough to provide anonymity. The work was hard, the tips modest, but it was honest and it was hers. For the first time since childhood, Victoria felt something like freedom. She continued her online studies, this time in graphic design, something she'd always loved, but her parents had dismissed as impractical. She made friends with other waitresses, went to movies, explored the city's bookstores and art galleries. Sometimes guilt crept in during quiet moments. She'd abandoned a marriage, broken a commitment, disappointed her family, but then she'd remember those cold months in Alexander's penthouse, the crushing loneliness of being married to a ghost, and she'd know she'd made the right choice. Her parents called frantically at first. Victoria answered once, briefly, telling them she was safe but needed space. She blocked their numbers after that, knowing their pressure would pull her back into that suffocating world. What Victoria didn't know was that Alexander had noticed her absence far more than she'd anticipated. He'd come home that night to find her note, the abandoned ring, the sudden emptiness of spaces she'd tried to make warm. And for the first time in years, Alexander Blackwood felt something other than cold efficiency. He felt loss. Alexander stared at Victoria's note for a long time that evening. His first instinct was to call his security team, have them track her down within hours. He picked up the phone twice and put it down twice. Something about the simplicity of her message stopped him. I can't do this anymore. He realized with uncomfortable clarity that he didn't actually know what this was. What had she endured that became unbearable? He'd provided for her materially, a luxury penthouse, unlimited funds, access to everything money could buy. But mentally replaying their 3 months together, Alexander couldn't remember a single real conversation they'd had. Couldn't remember asking about her day, her interests, her dreams. He'd treated their marriage like another business deal, signed, sealed, filed away to be forgotten. And she'd been a 19-year-old girl, thrust into a loveless arrangement, left alone in a cold apartment with a husband who barely acknowledged her existence. Alexander did eventually hire investigators, but he instructed them carefully. Find her. Confirm she's safe. Then stop. Don't approach her. Don't reveal yourselves. Just make sure she's okay. The report came back 2 weeks later. Victoria Chen, waitressing in Seattle, living modestly but safely, enrolled in online courses. The investigator included photos taken from a distance, Victoria laughing with co-workers, carrying art supplies into her apartment building, looking younger and lighter than Alexander remembered. He filed the report away and told his family she'd left, citing irreconcilable differences. There were legal complications with the business merger, tense negotiations, disappointed parents on both sides. Through it all, Alexander said nothing about knowing where Victoria was. That felt like the least he could do, give her the peace she'd sought. But Alexander couldn't quite let her go entirely. Every 6 months, he'd quietly check that report, update it, make sure she was still safe. It became a ritual, a penance, a way of holding on to something he'd lost before he'd ever really had it. Years passed. Victoria's life evolved. She graduated with her design degree, started freelancing, moved to a better apartment. And Alexander watched from a distance, protecting without intruding, a guardian she didn't know she had. Victoria had built a good life. At 24, she ran a small but successful graphic design studio, specializing in branding for local businesses. She shared an apartment with her best friend Marcus, a photographer who'd become the brother she'd never had. She dated occasionally, nothing serious, but she was learning to trust again, to open herself to possibilities. The past felt distant now. Sometimes she'd think about Alexander, wonder if he'd remarried, if he ever thought about her. Mostly, though, she focused on the present, on the life she'd chosen for herself. Then came the call from her mother. Victoria had unblocked her parents' numbers 2 years prior, maintaining cautious contact. Her mother's voice was urgent, tight with tears. Your father had a heart attack. He's in ICU. Please, Victoria, we need you. Victoria booked the next flight to San Francisco, her heart hammering. Whatever distance had grown between them, he was still her father. She arrived at the hospital to find her mother aged beyond her years, gripping Victoria's hands with desperate strength. Her father survived, but would need surgery and extensive recovery. Victoria stayed, working remotely, splitting time between the hospital and her childhood home. It was strange being back, occupying spaces she'd fled from, but her father's fragility put things in perspective. She'd been there 3 weeks when her mother mentioned almost casually, "Alexander knows you're here." He sent flowers to the hospital. Very kind of him. Victoria's stomach dropped. "You told him? He still asks about you sometimes. He never remarried, you know. I think—" Her mother hesitated. "I think he cared more than either of you realized." That evening, Victoria stood in the hospital parking lot, processing this information. Alexander had known where she was all these years, had checked on her. A mixture of emotions swirled. Violation of privacy, yes, but also something that felt uncomfortably like protection. She was still standing there when a familiar black car pulled into the lot, and Alexander Blackwell stepped out, older, more tired-looking, but unmistakably him. Their eyes met across the pavement. 5 years collapsed into a single moment. "Victoria," he said quietly. Just her name, but it carried the weight of everything unsaid between them. They stood in that parking lot as evening deepened around them, neither moving closer nor walking away. Victoria's pulse raced. 5 years of carefully constructed independence suddenly felt precarious. "What are you doing here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Alexander looked at her with an expression she'd never seen during their brief marriage. Something vulnerable, almost uncertain. "I heard about your father. I wanted to make sure you were all right. You've been checking on me." It wasn't a question. For 5 years, apparently. He didn't deny it. "I needed to know you were safe. After what I put you through." "You didn't put me through anything. We both got trapped in something neither of us wanted." "No." Alexander's voice was firm. "I trapped you. You were 19 years old, and I treated you like an inconvenient piece of furniture. I was so focused on my work, on proving myself, that I didn't see I'd married a real person with real feelings and real needs." Victoria had imagined versions of this conversation for years, but never like this. Never with Alexander taking full responsibility, his usual confidence replaced by something like regret. "Why didn't you come after me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Alexander's jaw tightened. "Because you asked me not to. Your note said you couldn't do this anymore. I finally understood what this was. Being invisible to someone who was supposed to care about you. You deserved better. You deserved to be free. So you just let me go?" "No." His eyes met hers. "I made sure you were safe, always. I had someone check on you regularly, but from a distance. I never interfered, never contacted you, never let anyone reveal my involvement. I owed you that much, a life of your own choosing." Victoria didn't know whether to be angry or touched. "That's still a violation of privacy." "I know, I'm sorry. I needed to know you were okay. It was selfish, but I couldn't completely let you go. You were my wife, even if I was a terrible husband." The honesty in his voice undid something in Victoria. This wasn't the cold, distant man she'd married. This was someone who'd spent 5 years carrying guilt, watching from afar, respecting boundaries, even when it must have been difficult. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry for everything." Alexander visited the hospital twice more that week, ostensibly to check on Victoria's father, with whom he'd maintained business ties. But Victoria noticed he timed his visits to when she'd be there. They'd sit in the cafeteria, drinking bad coffee, talking in ways they never had during their marriage. She learned things about him she'd never known, how he'd taken over his father's company at 28 after a hostile takeover attempt, sacrificing personal life to save hundreds of jobs. How he'd buried himself in work because it was the only thing he knew how to control. How their arranged marriage had been his father's dying wish, a man Alexander had desperately wanted to please. "I thought marriage would be like everything else in my life," Alexander admitted one evening. "Something I could manage through dedication and hard work. I didn't understand that people need attention, presence, emotional investment. I'd never learned those skills." Victoria found herself softening. "I ran away instead of trying to communicate. That wasn't fair either. You were 19 and scared. I was 35 and should have known better." They fell into a rhythm over the following weeks. Alexander would visit, they'd talk, and slowly the strangers they'd once been started becoming friends. Victoria was surprised to discover she liked him, this older, wiser version who'd learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness. Marcus noticed the change when Victoria video called him. "You're smiling differently. This is about him, isn't it?" Victoria couldn't deny it. "He's changed. Or maybe I'm finally seeing who he actually is." "Just be careful," Marcus warned. "He's still the guy who let you feel invisible." But was he? The Alexander she was getting to know seemed genuinely transformed by regret, by 5 years of reflecting on his failures. He asked about her design work, wanted to see her portfolio, listened to her stories about Seattle with genuine interest. One evening, walking through the hospital gardens, Alexander stopped. "I need to ask you something, not as your husband. I know legally we're still married, but I don't presume anything. As someone who cares about you, would you consider having dinner with me? Not here, somewhere neutral. I'd like to know the person you've become." Victoria should have said no, should have maintained boundaries, protected herself. But she was curious about where this unexpected connection might lead. Okay. One dinner. They met at a quiet Italian restaurant, far from the business district where Alexander might be recognized. Victoria wore a simple blue dress, felt simultaneously nervous and excited in a way she hadn't experienced since high school. Alexander arrived exactly on time, wearing casual clothes she'd never seen him in, dark jeans, a grey sweater that made his eyes look softer. The dinner conversation flowed surprisingly easily. They talked about books, discovered they both loved mystery novels, argued playfully about whether technology enhanced or diminished human connection, laughed over embarrassing childhood stories. For hours, they weren't former spouses with a complicated past. They were just two people getting to know each other. "I followed your company's growth," Alexander admitted over dessert. "You've built something impressive. The rebrand you did for Morrison's Coffee, I recognized your style immediately. Clean, warm, approachable. Everything I'm not." He said it with self-deprecating humor. "You're more approachable than you think," Victoria said. "At least, the current version of you is. The current version learned from the past version's massive mistakes." His expression grew serious. "I've been in therapy for 3 years, dealing with the fact that I sabotaged the most important relationship I'd ever had through emotional neglect. Learning to be present instead of always planning the next move." Victoria was stunned. Alexander Blackwood, admitting vulnerability, seeking help, working on himself. "What made you start?" "You leaving." Simple, direct, honest. "It forced me to examine why I'd built my entire life around work while letting everything else wither. My therapist helped me understand that I'd been running from intimacy because I didn't know how to handle it. Easier to bury myself in spreadsheets than risk failing at human connection." "And now?" Victoria asked softly. "Now I'm trying to be better. Probably still failing, but at least I'm aware of it." He looked at her directly. "I know I don't deserve a second chance. I know you've built a life without me, and you're happy. I'm not asking for anything except maybe we could be friends. Real friends this time?" Victoria's heart ached with the complexity of it all. The man sitting across from her bore little resemblance to the distant stranger she'd married. But was that growth real or just temporary? Could people truly change? "I'd like that," she heard herself say. "Friends." Over the next month, as Victoria's father slowly recovered, she and Alexander developed something unprecedented in their relationship: genuine friendship. They met for coffee, took walks, attended an art gallery opening together. Marcus remained skeptical, but admitted Alexander seemed different when Victoria showed him photos from their outings. Alexander opened up about his loneliness over the past 5 years. "I dated a few times. Nothing serious. Every woman felt like a comparison to what I'd lost. It wasn't fair to them or to me." Victoria shared her own dating experiences, the struggle to trust after feeling abandoned by her family and discarded by her husband. "I felt discarded," she admitted one evening. "Like I'd failed some test I didn't know I was taking." Alexander flinched. "You didn't fail anything. I did. I made you feel invisible because I was too emotionally stunted to see what was right in front of me. A brave, creative, lonely girl trying to make the best of an impossible situation. These conversations were healing for both of them." Slowly, Victoria began to understand that their marriage's failure wasn't entirely her fault or entirely his. It was a system doomed from the start. Two people forced together before they were ready, without the skills to bridge the gap between them. But now they were choosing to know each other. The difference was profound. Victoria's father was discharged from the hospital with strict orders for lifestyle changes. Her mother, overwhelmed, asked Victoria to stay longer. Victoria agreed, extending her remote work arrangement, settling into her childhood room in a way that felt surprisingly comfortable. Alexander helped in unexpected ways. He arranged for a private nurse to visit daily, taking pressure off Victoria's mother. He organized meal deliveries, connected them with the best cardiac specialists, used his resources to ease their burden. But he did it quietly, never seeking credit, simply helping because he cared. One evening, Victoria found him sitting with her father, just talking about business, about life, about regrets. Her father, who'd arranged the marriage, apologized for pushing them together so young. Alexander's response was gracious. "You wanted to protect your daughter's future. I failed to honor that trust, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to make it right now." Watching this, Victoria felt something shift inside her. Alexander wasn't performing or trying to win her back. He was simply being present, showing up, doing the work of being a good human. Victoria's time in San Francisco was supposed to end after 6 weeks. Instead, she found herself extending to 8 weeks, then 10. Marcus teased her about it. "Just admit you're falling for him again, or maybe falling for him for the first time." Was she? Victoria didn't know. The fluttery feeling she got when Alexander texted, the way she found herself dressing more carefully on days they'd meet, the disappointment when work kept him away. These were new experiences with someone who was technically still her husband, but felt like a discovery. They hadn't discussed their legal status. The marriage had never been annulled or divorced, just frozen in time. Victoria knew they'd eventually need to address it, but she was afraid that conversation would break whatever fragile thing they were building. One Saturday, Alexander invited her to his apartment. "I've remodeled since you left. I wanted you to see it if you're comfortable." Victoria was nervous walking into that space again, but it was transformed. The cold, minimalist penthouse she remembered was now warm, lived in. Bookshelves lined the walls, plants softened corners. Artwork, including pieces she recognized from Seattle galleries, added color and life. "I learned from you," Alexander explained. "You tried to make it warm and I didn't notice. So I noticed afterward. I kept thinking about what you'd do." Victoria walked through rooms that bore traces of her influence. Throw pillows in colors she loved, a reading nook by the window where she'd once tried to settle, even the brand of coffee she preferred stocked in the kitchen. "Alexander," she said carefully, "what is this? What are we doing?" He took a breath. "Honestly, I'm falling in love with you. Actually in love, not the concept of being married or the obligation. I love your laugh, your terrible jokes, the way you defend underdog coffee shops and argue about book endings. I love who you've become, and I'm in awe that you're giving me a chance to know you." Victoria's heart hammered. "We barely knew each other before." "Exactly. So maybe this is our real beginning. No arranged marriage, no family pressure, no business deals, just us, choosing each other." Victoria didn't answer immediately. She walked to the window, looking out over the city lights, processing. Part of her wanted to run again. This was too intense, too complicated, too risky. But another part remembered 5 years of wondering, what if? I don't know if I can trust this, she said finally. What happens when the novelty wears off, when you get busy with work and I become invisible again? Alexander came to stand beside her, not touching, respecting space. I can't promise perfection. I'm still learning to balance work and life, but I can promise I'll never make you invisible again. I'll fail sometimes. I'm human, but I'll always come back, always apologize, always try to do better. Words are easy. Then let me show you. Take all the time you need, go back to Seattle, live your life. I'll visit, not like before, not as surveillance, but as someone who wants to be part of your world. Let me prove through actions that I've changed. Victoria turned to face him. And if I decide I don't want to try again? Pain flashed across Alexander's face, but he nodded. Then I'll respect that. I'll file for divorce if you want it clean, or we can maintain the legal status quo if that's easier. Whatever you need. The honesty undid her. This was what she'd needed 5 years ago, someone willing to meet her where she was, to respect her agency, to let her choose freely. I need to think, she said. I need to go back to Seattle, to my normal life, and figure out if this is real or if I'm just caught up in nostalgia for something we never had. That's fair. Alexander reached for her hand tentatively. When she didn't pull away, he held it gently. Thank you for giving me any chance at all. I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful. Victoria flew back to Seattle 3 days later. Alexander didn't ask to come with her, didn't pressure for immediate answers. He simply said goodbye at the airport with a hug that felt like a promise and a plea combined. Back in her apartment, surrounded by the life she'd built, Victoria felt the distance clarify things. Marcus asked the hard questions. Do you love him, or do you love the idea of him? Can you forgive him? Are you ready to risk your heart again? Victoria didn't have easy answers. Alexander kept his word. He visited Seattle twice a month, staying at a hotel, never presuming to intrude on Victoria's space. They'd meet for dinner, walk through Pike Place Market, attend concerts. He met Marcus properly, enduring a protective interrogation that would have intimidated lesser men. He showed interest in Victoria's work, her friends, her world, not trying to change it, but to understand it. Between visits, they texted daily. Video calls where Alexander would be in his office late at night and Victoria would be sketching, and they'd just exist in parallel, company without pressure. Slowly, Victoria began to trust that this wasn't performance. This was who Alexander was becoming. 3 months after she'd returned to Seattle, Victoria made a decision. She called Alexander on a Tuesday evening. I want to try. Silence on the other end, then his voice, rough with emotion. Are you sure? No, she admitted. I'm terrified, but I'm more afraid of spending the rest of my life wondering what we could have been if I'd had the courage to try. What does trying look like for you? Alexander asked. We date, properly, like people who are getting to know each other. No rushing, no assumptions. We're still technically married, but we pretend we're not. We start from scratch. I can do that. I want to do that. They agreed on ground rules. Honesty above everything. Communication when things felt wrong. Space when needed. Slowly building trust through consistent action, not grand gestures. Victoria told her parents she was giving Alexander another chance. Her mother cried with relief. Her father, still recovering, simply said, "Be careful with your heart, but don't close it off to the possibility of love." The next 6 months were a strange dance. Alexander relocated his primary office to Seattle, maintaining operations in San Francisco, but making Victoria's city his home base. They had date nights, argued about normal couple things like restaurant choices and movie selections, celebrated small milestones like their first real anniversary, not their wedding date, but the day they'd reconnected in that hospital parking lot. Victoria introduced Alexander to her Seattle friends. He fit in better than expected, shedding his CEO persona to be just Alex, the guy who was crazy about Victoria and trying to deserve her. They still hadn't discussed the physical aspect of their relationship. Their marriage had never been consummated. Now they were taking things slow, rebuilding from friendship. Their first real kiss happened 4 months in, after a particularly good date, gentle and full of promise. A year after reconnecting, Victoria and Alexander stood in the same church where they'd first married. But this time, everything was different. They'd arranged a small, intimate ceremony, a vow renewal that felt more like a real wedding. Only close friends and immediate family attended, no business associates, no elaborate reception, no sense of obligation. Victoria wore a simple white dress she'd chosen herself. Alexander had tears in his eyes when he saw her, something the cold businessman from 6 years ago never would have allowed. They'd written their own vows. Victoria went first. 6 years ago, I married a stranger out of duty. Today, I'm marrying my best friend out of choice. Alexander, you've shown me that people can change, can grow, can learn from their mistakes. You've respected my independence while showing me that accepting love doesn't mean losing myself. I choose you every day, knowing that we'll have hard moments but trusting that we'll face them together. Alexander's voice shook as he spoke. Victoria, I failed you once by not seeing your worth. I won't make that mistake again. You saved me by leaving, forced me to become someone worthy of your love. Today, I promise to never make you invisible, to always fight for us, to build a marriage based on partnership and respect. You are my greatest adventure and my safest harbor. I choose you freely and completely. There wasn't a dry eye in the small chapel. When they kissed, it felt like a true beginning, not an ending or an obligation. They were both different people now. Victoria no longer the scared 19-year-old, Alexander no longer the emotionally distant CEO. They'd earned this second chance through hard work, honesty, and the courage to be vulnerable. The reception was held at a small restaurant, nothing like the elaborate affair from their first wedding. They danced, laughed, celebrated with people who actually knew them as a couple rather than a business arrangement. Marcus gave a toast to the couple who proved that sometimes the best love stories have terrible first drafts. Here's to your rewrite. Later that night, in the penthouse that was now truly theirs, Victoria and Alexander stood on the balcony watching the city lights. Do you think we would have made it work if I hadn't left? Victoria asked. No, Alexander answered honestly. We weren't ready. We both needed to grow separately before we could grow together. Sometimes love requires the courage to walk away so you can come back stronger. Victoria leaned into him. I'm glad I came back. I'm glad I became someone worth coming back to. They'd bought a house in Seattle together, a compromise between Victoria's cozy aesthetic and Alexander's need for workspace. It was filled with both their books, both their art, both their dreams. Alexander had restructured his company to allow remote work, prioritizing presence over prestige. Victoria's design studio had grown, with Alexander as her biggest cheerleader, sending clients her way, but never overshadowing her accomplishments. They talked about starting a family eventually, but there was no rush. They were finally learning to be married, the daily negotiations, the comfortable silences, the joy of building something together rather than existing in parallel. The 19-year-old bride who had vanished 6 years ago was gone forever. In her place was a woman who knew her worth, who'd built a life on her own terms, and who'd chosen love not out of obligation, but out of genuine partnership. And the distant CEO had transformed into a man who understood that the greatest success wasn't measured in profit margins, but in the ability to show up, be present, and choose love every single day. Sometimes the story we think we're living turns out to be just the prologue. The real story, the one about two people learning to truly see each other, to honor each other, to choose each other, was only just beginning, and this time they were both all in.